Hello again. In the 1950s and 1960s, I was growing up in Ilford, which was at that time a town in Essex rather than being part of London. It did not officially become a London suburb until 1965, at which time I was a teenager. Growing up in Seven Kings, which is really a part of Ilford or on the fringe of Ilford, I found the whole district almost unbearably dull and grey. The thumbnail to this video shows Seven Kings High Road in the 1950s when I started school. It looks as though it could have been 100 years ago, never mind the 1950s. Dull it may have been, but it was also the quietest and safest place that you can possibly imagine. The last excitement which Ilford had experienced was the murder of Percy Thompson in 1922, for which his wife Edith and her lover were hanged the following year. This murder was remarkable chiefly because, although a domestic crime, it had been committed in the street by means of a stabbing. Children would point out the spot in Belgrave Road where the crime had been committed. Even 30 or 40 years later, it was still remembered locally with amazement and indeed a kind of ghastly thrill. Just imagine a man being stabbed to death in the street. I'm not exaggerating about this, by the way. It really was absolutely unheard of at that time for somebody to be stabbed in the street. Ilford had never seen anything like it before and probably never would again. Today, that world has vanished, perhaps for good. Nobody would describe Ilford as a quiet and dull place these days. And the idea that anybody would be surprised at the idea of a man being stabbed in the street is pretty grotesque. It is, of course, not just men who are being stabbed in that part of London these days. Let's run through a few recent crimes in Ilford and Seven Kings. Just over the last year or so, that is, and see how things have changed since then. I attended a primary school called Downsall, which was in St John's Road, up towards Newbury Park. On Friday, July the 8th last year, a woman was stabbed in the back in that street by a man who simply rode up on a bike and stuck a knife in her. This was shortly after a woman called Zara Elena was beaten to death in the street by Jordan McSweeney. Less than 3 weeks ago, a man in his 60s was stabbed in Seven Kings High Road and left with what are described as life-changing injuries. A month ago, on February the 22nd, 2 men engaged in a knife fight in Ilford High Road, as a result of which both men were stabbed. The previous month, a boy was found with stab wounds in Ilford Lane. A couple of weeks before that, in December 2022, a 17-year-old boy was wounded in a knife fight in Ilford. Nor is it just stabbings. On October the 25th last year, 2 men were shot dead at a house in Henley Road in Ilford. Their names were Saeed Abu Sheikh and Zakaria Jelani Muhammad. Ayana Ali Aden and Ayman Abu Sheikh have been charged with their murder. I think the viewers will get the point, and I've just described a few cases in Ilford over the last 9 months or so. I give links to them all in the description to this video. The obvious question is, why was Ilford such a dull and respectable place for the whole of the 20th century, and what happened to turn it into a war zone? Part of the answer lies in the rapidity with which the area changed over 25 years or so. When I started school there, the population was almost 100% white British, with a sprinkling of Irish and Polish families. I still remember some of those Polish children I was at school with: Marcelo Andruszkiewicz, Rochelle Zielinski, Erwin Czechowicz, and so on. Nobody objected in the least to Polish people living in that area. I remember when the Sikhs began arriving too, and I honestly don't remember anybody at all complaining about them either. They lived their lives quietly and unremarkably, and they were indistinguishable from anybody else. I've never in my life encountered an antisocial Sikh, by the way. Later, there were a few black families, and nobody was bothered about them either. This was because none of these people altered the essential character of the area. They came to live there, and they fitted in with the way of life. Then things changed dramatically. Two things changed. The first was that from the 1980s onward, the accepted liberal doctrine changed. Up until then, the idea had been that integration was the way to cope with immigration. That is to say, that if a Jamaican or Sikh came to live in Britain, then they would live like British people and share the same way of life and values as everybody else in the country. That worked very well. By and large, yes, there were difficulties, obviously. The new idea, though, which took hold was called multiculturalism, and this meant that instead of immigrants to this country fitting into British ways, they would be encouraged to preserve their own culture and customs, so that society might become a mosaic of different cultures. Instead of one culture that everybody shared, there would be a lot of different cultures. Now, that might work well enough if we're talking about customs relating to religion, clothes and food. But the problem arises when some people have customs relating to stabbing and shooting each other, or committing rape, or going in for forced marriages or child sex. This can cause problems. The second thing that changed was an enormous acceleration in immigration, which began 25 years ago. Enormous does not really meet the case here. More foreigners have come to live in Britain in the last 25 years than over the whole of the 2,000 years before that. That is the scale of immigration. Combine that with the new immigrants being encouraged to follow the customs of their own countries rather than adapting to our way of life, and you can see how the stage was set for, well, I won't say disaster, but certainly problems. Ilford shows with appalling clarity what the consequences of these twin policies has been.